A mob boss, a fired housekeeper, a pregnancy test broken into pieces on a mahogany desk, and 6 years of silence that nearly destroyed them both. She never told him, not because she was weak, but because she knew exactly what his world would do to an innocent child. This is a channel for people who believe that real strength isn't about power. It's about showing up when it matters most. The lesson this story carries: the people we dismiss without listening are sometimes the ones holding the most important truth. Hit like if that landed, share this with someone, subscribe and stay, because every story here is one worth finishing.
Camille stood up slowly, her legs shaking beneath her. She willed herself to stay strong, knowing that if she fell apart now, she would never recover. Ronan had already returned his focus to his laptop screen as though the matter was settled, as if her 3 years of devoted service had been reduced to a simple signature. Now he could just continue with his day. But Camille did not leave right away. She stopped in the center of the room, her hand instinctively going to her apron pocket. Her fingers found the small plastic stick she had been hiding all morning. She pulled it out. The two red lines on the pregnancy test were still visible in the dim light coming through the thick curtains. She stared at it for a final moment. Those two parallel lines looked like separate roads that would never cross. One was the life she was being forced to live, and the other was the life she should have had. Then, she snapped it in half. The sound of the plastic breaking was sharp and loud in the quiet room. She broke it again into smaller pieces, and then let them fall onto the polished surface of his desk. They scattered near a drawer. The sound of the plastic hitting the wood was almost silent, but for Camille, it was the heaviest sound she had ever heard. Ronan looked up, his gray eyes fixing on her with a cold, detached curiosity, the look of a man who controlled every aspect of his domain. "What is that?" he asked. His voice was flat and emotionless, the same tone he used to question his accountant about a strange expense on a report. Camille did not reply. For the first time in 3 years, she did not lower her eyes when he spoke to her. She looked directly at him. In her tear-filled brown eyes, Ronan saw something he had never seen before. It was not fear or hate, but a surprising sense of pity for the man who was throwing her out. "Thank you for the last 3 years, Mr. Marchetti," she said. Her voice trembled, but each word was delivered with careful intention. "I just hope you never have to lie awake at night, regretting a decision you made without knowing the whole truth." Her words hung in the cigar-scented air. Ronan did not answer, not because he was ignoring her, but because something in her tone left him completely speechless. For a man who always had the right words in any situation, this feeling was both new and irritating. Camille turned her back on him and walked toward the door. Her gloved hand wrapped around the cold brass doorknob, and she pulled the heavy door open. Two of his bodyguards stood in the hall. They glanced at her and then quickly looked away. In their world, a departing housekeeper was not important enough to notice. The door closed behind her with a soft click, not a slam. The sound of the latch settling into the frame was quiet, but that small sound would echo in Ronan Marchetti's mind for years, a ghost he could never quite explain. Ronan sat perfectly still for several moments after she left. He looked down at the signed document, the blue ink still shiny, and then his eyes drifted to the wastebasket by the door. An impulse told him to get up and look inside, but he fought it. Ronan Marchetti was not the kind of man to dig through the trash to understand a servant's feelings. At least that was the story he told himself. Instead, he rose and crossed the room to the window. From his second-floor view, through the thick, bulletproof glass, he gazed down at the front lawn. A fierce Chicago rain was coming down in thick curtains, turning the vibrant green grass into a sad, gray reflection. And in the center of that gray landscape, Camille was walking toward the gate. She did not run or duck her head to avoid the storm. She walked with a steady pace along the stone path, like someone accustomed to carrying burdens far heavier than rain. Her small frame became a blur in the downpour. She walked past the iron fence, through the automatic gate that opened to release her from the Marchetti estate. She was re-entering a world she would now have to navigate alone, with a new life quietly growing inside her. Ronan stood there and watched until she completely vanished from sight. He was not sure why he waited so long. He had fired people before, ended partnerships, and made choices 100 times colder without a second thought. But this time felt different. There was something in her final words, in the way she looked at him with pity instead of anger. And there was that sound of cracking plastic that he did not understand. He went back to his desk, sat down, and pulled the laptop toward him. He forced himself to focus on numbers, calls, and commands. Because that was how Ronan Marchetti dealt with anything he did not want to feel, so he worked until every emotion was gone. But that night, as the mansion grew still, he lay alone in a bed too large for one, and Camille's words echoed in his mind. "I hope you never wake up in the middle of the night." He opened his eyes, staring into the ceiling's darkness. For a brief second, he wondered if he had missed something crucial. But the thought disappeared, because Ronan Marchetti was not a man who ever admitted he was wrong. 6 years would pass before he finally understood that on that night, he had pushed more than just a woman in a rain-soaked uniform out the gate. He had pushed away everything he never knew he needed. That evening, the Marchetti mansion was lit as brightly as ever. The private chef arranged dinner on a table that could seat 12 people, yet only a single plate was set at its head, Ronan's usual seat, where he faced a bare wall as if its emptiness was the only guest he would tolerate. He sliced his steak, raised his wine, and chewed slowly, with the same precision and control he used to manage every part of the Marchetti empire. His phone buzzed halfway through dinner. He answered it without looking at the caller's name. In his world, only a few people could call at that hour, and every call meant either money or a problem. His uncle, Tommaso, was on the line, reporting that a shipment needed to move through Southport before sunrise. There was a problem with the transport crew, and they were waiting for his command. Ronan put his wine glass down, gave calm and clear orders in under 2 minutes, and then ended the conversation. There was no hesitation, no debating his choices, no losing sleep over decisions involving hundreds of thousands of dollars in risks that normal people could never comprehend. He resumed his meal, cut another piece of steak, and his life continued to run around him, flawless, smooth, and cold, like a machine programmed to never slow down for anybody. But once dinner was over, and he was walking down the hall toward his office, he found his feet stopping at the doorway of the room Camille had left only hours before. He did not enter immediately. He stood there for a few seconds, his gaze falling to the carpet where she had been sitting, and her last words surfaced in his thoughts like a ghost. He took a deep breath, opened the door, sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and buried himself in work. Ronan Marchetti believed any feeling without a purpose was a weakness. And in his world, weakness was not just pointless, it was lethal. At the same time, nearly 15 miles southwest of the Gold Coast mansion, Camille was at a bus stop on Ashland, completely soaked. The rain was coming down hard, and the wind blowing off Lake Michigan cut through the bus shelter where a pane of glass was missing. She was still in her black uniform, her white apron now stained gray by the rain. She had stuffed her yellow rubber gloves into the pocket of the light jacket she'd put on before leaving the mansion. The final CTA bus of the night showed up 10 minutes late, and for those 10 minutes, Camille stood by herself under a flickering street lamp with one hand placed on her stomach. It was not from pain, but from a protective instinct, as if she were guarding the one thing in the world that was truly hers. The bus was almost deserted when it arrived. She took a seat in the back row by the window, pressed her forehead to the cold glass, and watched the city of Chicago glide by. The glowing skyscrapers of downtown eventually faded into shorter, older, and darker buildings as the bus continued its journey south. She saw neon signs from late-night convenience stores, metal gates locked over closed shops, and graffiti art on rain-drenched brick walls. This was Pilsen, the neighborhood Camille had always known as home, where Spanish was spoken on every corner, and the aroma of sweet bread from local bakeries was more comforting than any designer perfume in the Marchetti mansion. She got off at the corner of 18th and walked quickly for 2 blocks to the old apartment on the third floor of a red brick building constructed in the 1950s. The concrete steps were damp and musty, the iron railing was wobbly, and the light in the hallway flickered as if it might go out at any moment. She let herself in using the extra key Aunt Polar always hid under the potted plant near the door. The small apartment was silent. Aunt Polar was sleeping, her heavy breaths coming from the back bedroom. The breathing of a 52-year-old woman whose diabetes had drained nearly all of her energy. Camille did not flip on the lights. She went into the small room her aunt allowed her to use. It had a single bed, an old dresser made of particle board, and a window that overlooked the alley where stray cats would sometimes howl at night. She sat on the bed's edge, still damp and cold, and took the copy of the agreement she had signed just a few hours ago from her coat pocket. She looked at her signature. The blue ink was slightly smeared in the corner by her tears. And for the first time since she left that room, she let the fear completely overwhelm her. It was not the fear of being poor, or the fear of being by herself. It was fear for the life growing inside of her. She knew the kind of man Ronan Marchetti was. She knew the rules of his world because she had spent 3 years cleaning up the messes it created. She was aware that in his world, a mafia boss's illegitimate child was not a gift, it was a strategic piece. Enemies would use the child for leverage. Allies would use the child for negotiations. And Ronan himself, what would he do? Would he keep the baby? Would he hide the baby somewhere? Or would he make the baby just another one of the hundreds of secrets the Marchetti family kept hidden under the foundation of their Gold Coast home? Camille folded the paper, placed it in the nightstand drawer, and put her hand over her stomach. Her belly was still flat. There was no visible sign of anything, but inside, a small heart was beating, and each beat gave her a reason to make the most critical choice of her life. She would not tell Ronan. Not out of hatred, and not for revenge, but for protection. She would vanish from anything associated with the Marchetti name. She would raise this child on her own. In her world, a world of late buses, old apartments, and small, honest wages. A world where no one was killed for knowing too much, and no child had to be raised behind bulletproof windows. She laid down, clutched the thin blanket to her chest, and in the dark of that small room in Pilsen, barely 15 miles from the Gold Coast mansion, but as distant as another planet, Camille Reyes closed her eyes with a resolution she had never felt before. She would be more powerful than fear. She had to be, because she was no longer living just for herself anymore. In the weeks that came after, Camille went from one business to the next. She applied for a job at a restaurant on 18th Street, and the manager just glanced at her stomach and shook his head before she could even finish her sentence. The laundromat at the corner of Ashland claimed they had all the help they needed. The grocery store on Blue Island was looking for someone for the night shift, but when she returned a second time wearing a loose shirt that could not conceal her 4-month belly, they said the job had been filled. Each time she was rejected, Camille held back her tears and just moved on to the next place because she didn't have the luxury of giving up. Inside of her, someone was counting on her to keep going. She finally got a job cleaning offices for a small company downtown, working a shift from 10 o'clock at night to 4 in the morning. She was paid in cash each week, just enough to pay her part of the rent to Aunt Polar and to buy simple food. But the daily CTA bus fare was an expense she could not afford if she wanted to put money aside for the months after the baby was born. So, she walked 40 minutes every afternoon from Pilsen to downtown and 40 minutes home at dawn. Her body grew heavier each day and her shoe soles wore away, but she never slowed her pace. Then the Chicago winter hit. It was a cold that was hard to imagine, a cold that bit through skin and bone. The wind from Lake Michigan cut through clothes like they were nothing. One January night, the temperature fell to -15 degrees. Camille was on Halsted, walking home, when her legs simply gave out. Her vision blurred, and ears rang. 6 months pregnant, her belly pulled her forward until she stumbled against a lamppost and slid to the ground. Snow soaked through her pants. She tried to cry for help on the empty street at 3 in the morning, but her voice was a whisper. Her breath became a white puff that the frozen air swallowed. She sat there for maybe 5 minutes, maybe 15. Then she heard footsteps, felt a warm hand on her shoulder, and thought it must be a dream. It was Father Miguel Cortez, the priest from St. Pius Church in Pilsen, returning from visiting a very sick member of his church. He saw her there, huddled and pregnant with purple lips, and asked no questions. He just helped her stand, wrapped his heavy wool coat around her, and walked her to the church. He had her sit near the heater, gave her hot soup, and waited for the color to return to her face. "You do not have to explain," he said softly in Spanish. "Just know that you are not alone." After that, Father Miguel became her unexpected source of strength. The church had little money, but he gave her groceries from the pantry each week. He offered her a warm seat when the Chicago cold was too much to bear. Most importantly, he gave her the faith that she was making the right choice. Aunt Polar also helped however she could. Diabetes weakened her, swelling her legs so she could not walk far. But when Camille's morning sickness was terrible, Polar would sit with her, rubbing her back with shaky hands. She told stories about Camille's own mother, how strong she was carrying Camille alone in Puerto Rico before they came to Chicago, as if courage was a family trait. One day, Camille saw a roll of creamy white yarn for 50 cents in a thrift store on 19th Street. She hesitated for a moment before going inside to buy it. In her small room that evening, she started to knit a little hat. She was not a skilled knitter, the stitches were uneven, but she worked slowly and patiently. While she knitted, she whispered to her 7-month belly, "I promise you will have so much love. I will figure out the rest. But you will have enough love, because I have enough for both of us." The little hat was flawed and poorly shaped, but Camille made it with her last few cents and with the one thing she truly owned: hope. The first pain started at 2 in the morning on a November night. The Chicago wind howled outside her Pilsen window, and Camille knew her time had come. She called an ambulance, having no one to take her. As she waited, she put the lopsided white hat she had made over the last 2 months in her bag. It was the only gift she had prepared for her coming baby. The siren woke Aunt Polar, who limped into the hall on her swollen feet. She took Camille's hand and promised to take the first bus, but Camille knew the last bus had already passed hours ago. She just nodded and gave her aunt a reassuring smile before getting into the ambulance by herself. At 3 in the morning, Stroger Hospital was a blur of bright lights, beeping machines, and long corridors. Pains came in waves as they wheeled her down the hall. The delivery area was busy. It was Chicago's biggest public hospital, and many women gave birth there alone, just like her. A nurse named Rosa, a kind Mexican woman with warm hands, stayed with Camille through it all. When the pain was at its worst, Camille needed to squeeze a hand. Not her mother's, who was gone, and not the father's, who would never know. She took Rosa's hand and squeezed with all her might. Rosa squeezed back like it was the most natural thing. For her, it was. At Stroger Hospital, many mothers welcomed their babies into the world, with only a nurse for support. Amelia was born at 5:47 in the morning. Her first cry filled the room, a bold announcement that she had made it, that she was alive despite everything. A nurse placed Amelia on Camille's chest, and the world seemed to stop. Camille gazed at the tiny baby against her. Dark, wet hair stuck to her head, her skin was pink, and her small fists were clenched tight. Then Amelia opened her eyes. They were gray-green, not brown like Camille's or anyone else in her family. They were the clear, deep, gray-green eyes of Ronan Marchetti, staring up at her from the small face of her child. Camille began to weep. It was not out of sadness or fear. She cried from the understanding that no matter how she tried to escape the Marchetti name, those eyes would be a daily reminder of the man she decided not to tell. She hugged Amelia close, kissed her forehead, and whispered just for them, "You are all mine, only mine." A few hours later, Aunt Polar arrived at the hospital, out of breath from walking part of the way. An employee from the hospital administration gave Camille the birth certificate to complete. With a shaky hand, she filled it out in blue ink. The child's name, Amelia Reyes. Date of birth, place of birth. Mother's name, Camille Reyes. Then she got to the line for the father. It was a blank space. The pen hovered over the paper as she stared at the empty line. She was not unsure of what to write. She knew the name that belonged there, and she was making the choice to leave it blank. She took a deep breath, left the line empty, and signed her name under Mother. Her signature took on the responsibility of both parents. She returned the form without a second thought. 6 years can pass in an instant on a calendar. But when you fight for every day, 6 years is a lifetime. In the first months of Amelia's life, Camille practically held her baby with one arm while cleaning floors with the other. She worked her cleaning job downtown at night, leaving Amelia with Aunt Polar. During Amelia's naps, Camille attended a free business course for low-income women at the Pilsen Community Center. She sat with other immigrant women, many with their own small children in the classroom, learning about bookkeeping, taxes, and how to start a business in Illinois. She was not the top student, but she never missed a single class. After 3 years of working for others, when Amelia was in preschool, Camille had saved a small amount by living on almost nothing but rent and food. She then started Olympia Services, her very own cleaning business. Her first 2 clients were a dental office and an accounting firm in Pilsen. They trusted her because they had seen her hard work for 3 years. Camille made a simple promise: she would do a good job. And she always did. Word of mouth helped her business grow. After a year, she hired her first worker, a single mother from Guatemala named Maria. Then she hired more. When Amelia turned 5, Olympia Services had 8 employees. They were all single mothers or immigrants, people other companies had rejected. Camille gave them a chance. Her pay was not the highest, but it was always on time. She provided insurance when she could and treated everyone with respect because she knew the pain of being looked down on. Amelia was raised in that small, clean apartment, its walls decorated with butterfly. Her room held magazine cutouts and a twin bed against the wall. A lumpy, cream-colored knit hat sat on the nightstand like a treasure. Even as her health failed, Aunt Polar greeted Amelia each afternoon while Camille worked, teaching her Spanish rice and telling tales of Puerto Rico. Amelia was bilingual before kindergarten, with mysterious gray-green eyes that did not belong to any Reyes. Across town, 6 years for Ronan Marchetti meant building an empire. Marchetti Holdings seized 3 more riverfront real estate projects, expanding the legitimate front for his criminal enterprise. Business magazines hailed him as a visionary, but the streets knew the truth behind his name. 2 years after Camille, he entered an arranged marriage with an allied family's daughter from back east, a political move the mob called locking down territory. That marriage fell apart after 2 years. His wife took a huge settlement, saying she could not live with a man who was on guard even in his sleep. Other women followed, but none stayed long. They all left with the same parting words: "You cannot trust anyone." Ronan never disagreed. He knew it was true. He also never changed, because trust was a liability in his business, not a strength. His Gold Coast mansion remained perfectly lit and flawlessly maintained, yet it grew colder and more silent. A single-place setting still marked the head of the dining table. Laughter never echoed in the living room. On some nights, alone in his office, the blue glow of his laptop illuminating a half-finished whiskey, a specific memory would surface. Not the whole day, just a fragment. Camille's eyes as she said goodbye at the door. He was an expert in eyes, fearful, hateful, begging. But hers were something new, a type he had never seen before. They held no guilt, only a profound disappointment, the kind you have for someone you thought was a better man. That look stayed with him, a ghost more unsettling than any rival trying to take his turf. He knew how to deal with enemies. He had no idea how to deal with the look from the woman he had wrongly dismissed. His transformation started not with a guilty conscience, but with the federal government. 6 years after Camille was gone, federal investigators tightened their grip on the money laundering network hidden within his real estate ventures. 2 subpoenas landed within a week. Prosecutors began summoning witnesses. A Cayman Islands account was frozen without notice. To protect his empire, Ronan knew he needed a full accounting of the last 10 years of cash flow, not to come clean, but to decide what evidence to bury and which assets to cut loose. He summoned Yelena Vulov, his trusted lawyer and financial strategist, in finance, demanding a complete internal audit. For 3 weeks, Yelena sifted through countless transactions, unearthing something Ronan never anticipated. She discovered a long-running series of cash withdrawals, each one carefully kept small to fly under the radar, but adding up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. The trail led to the only other person with access to the family's private finances, Gianni Marchetti. Late one night, Yelena set the folder on Ronan's desk, met his gaze, and told him that $50,000 6 years ago was not a one-time thing. It was just the beginning. Ronan absorbed every line. The figures were undeniable. Gianni had been bleeding money from a backup safe, from business accounts, and even from the slush fund for illicit operations. It all went to cover gambling debts with loan sharks connected to the Volkov Syndicate, a rival outfit fighting for control of Chicago's South Side. His brother was not just a thief, he had been bankrolling the enemy. The report. After a long, heavy silence, he spoke just 2 words to Yelena. Bring him. Gianni arrived at the mansion around 10 that night, completely oblivious, wearing his usual smile for a visit with his brother. But 2 guards bypassed the living room and escorted him straight to the basement. This was not a wine cellar. It was a room with concrete walls, harsh white lighting, a steel table, and 2 chairs, the place where the Marchetti family solved its off-the-books problems. Ronan was waiting, the audit report open before him. The moment Gianni saw the papers, his smile vanished. Brother, I can explain. Sit. Ronan's tone was quiet, but it carried a weight that made Gianni instantly obey. It was the voice he used right before irreversible things occurred. Ronan said little more. He pushed the report over and waited. Gianni spent the first 5 minutes in denial, the next 10 making excuses. But as Ronan just stared, his gray eyes as cold as the floor, Gianni finally shattered. The whole story came out, gambling debts that started when he was 25, losing fortunes at illegal card games, and loan sharks promising to snap his fingers one by one. Desperation drove him to his brother's safe. After hearing it all, Ronan took a long breath and posed the one question that mattered. 6 years ago, the money. Did she take it? A heavy silence fell. Gianni bowed his head. No. You knew all along. It was not a question. She was just the housekeeper, Gianni mumbled to the floor. Who was going to take her word for it? I figured you would never know and it would blow over. The room was so still they could hear a single drop of water hitting the concrete. Ronan stared at his brother, the man who shared his last name, his childhood home. In that moment, he saw a reflection of the person he despised most, their father. The old man had always used the weak as shields for his own errors, sacrificing those who could not defend themselves to protect his favorites. Ronan had promised himself he would never be that man. But he had been 6 years ago. He had discarded an innocent woman without a second thought, without a single question, refusing her any chance to speak her truth, simply because she was the most vulnerable person there. In his line of work, the weakest were always the scapegoats. Ronan got to his feet and looked down at Gianni. You have 24 hours to get out of Chicago. Every family account, every card, all your access is terminated now. You are no longer a Marchetti. Gianni started to protest, but one look from his brother silenced him. He knew that walking out of that room alive was the only kindness he would ever get from Ronan again. After Gianni was gone, Ronan remained in the cold basement. For the first time in 6 years, the memory of Camille Reyes was not a hazy outline. Her face was perfectly clear, and the image was agonizing. He realized he owed her a debt that money could never settle. He did not head for his bedroom. Instead, he returned to his second-floor office. He needed to face the ugly truth alone. In the same space where 6 years earlier he had condemned an innocent woman. He sank into his chair in the darkness, ignoring the laptop and the liquor cart. Headlights from the street cut stripes of light across the hardwood floor. He began to clean his desk, not out of a need for order, but to keep his hands busy and his thoughts from overwhelming him. He opened a drawer, sorting through old contracts and useless business cards. As he pulled the drawer completely free to set it down, a small object dropped out. It had been stuck for years in the space behind the drawer. Ronan retrieved a small white piece of plastic, maybe an inch and a half long, yellowed with age. He was about to throw it away when a faint pink line on its surface caught the light from the window. His breath caught. An image from 6 years ago flashed in his memory, suddenly vivid. He saw Camille at the door, taking something from her apron, looking down at it, and then hearing the distinct sound of it breaking. Crack of plastic in an otherwise silent room. He had asked, "What is that?" And she had not replied. Back then, it had not mattered enough to him to ask a second time. Now, as he held the plastic piece between two fingers, for the very first time, it mattered. He took out his phone and did an image search for pregnancy tests. The screen was filled with the results. White plastic sticks with little windows that showed either one or two pink lines. He looked down at the piece in his hand, then looked back at the screen. The pink line, the same type of plastic, the same size. His heart began to beat faster. It was not the kind of pulse he felt when he was in danger, but the kind that happens when the ground beneath you starts to give way, and everything you thought you knew becomes uncertain. She was pregnant on that day. The thought struck him with a force he was not ready for. He put the plastic down on the desk, picked up his phone, and dialed Yelena. It was almost 1 o'clock in the morning, but Yelena answered on the second ring, because when Ronan Marchetti calls at 1 o'clock in the morning, it is not a call that can be ignored until morning. "I need you to find someone," he said. "Camille Reyes. She worked here 6 years ago. Find everything about her over the past 6 years. Her address, her job, her family. I want it all. And do not let her find out." Yelena did not ask questions. She never did. She only asked for a deadline. 2 days, Ronan replied before ending the call. Yelena had it done in a day and a half. The file was on Ronan's desk the following afternoon. It was neat, detailed, and coldly efficient, like everything Yelena did. Camille Reyes, age 28, lived in Pilsen, Chicago. She was the owner of Olympia Services, a commercial cleaning company registered in Illinois, with 8 people on her payroll. She had one daughter, Amelia Reyes, 5 years old, who attended Arcos Academy, a public school in the neighborhood. The birth certificate listed the father as unknown. Ronan read that line again. 5 years old. She would have been pregnant 6 years ago. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a brutal, undeniable clarity. He turned to the next page and froze. Yelena had included a photograph from the Olympia Services social media account, taken at a company family event. Camille was standing in the middle of her employees, smiling, and right beside her was a little girl in a flowered dress. She had thick, dark hair and a firm chin and gray-green eyes that looked right through the camera without any hesitation. Ronan stared at the photograph, and his world came to a halt. He knew those eyes because they were the same ones that looked back at him from the mirror every morning. That face, that jawline, the fearless way the child met the lens. It was the exact same way he met anyone's gaze without blinking. He put the report down, got up, and walked onto the balcony. Chicago glittered below him with millions of lights. Somewhere in that massive city, in a small Pilsen apartment, a 5-year-old child with his eyes was sleeping, with no idea who her father was. Ronan clutched the railing. For the very first time, the hands that approved deals most people could never imagine, hands that never shook before any adversary, began to tremble. Before Ronan could decide on a course of action, fate decided for him. 2 weeks after that night, Benny Tran, the manager of the Marchetti Holdings 18-story office tower in River North, submitted a new cleaning contract to administration. The selected company was Olympia Services. They had the best price of 4 bidders, glowing reviews from past clients, and a perfect legal background. Benny had no idea there was a connection between the company's owner and his own boss. To him, it was just a standard business decision: hire the best service for the lowest price. The contract was signed, and the name Camille Reyes officially entered the Marchetti holding system before Ronan ever saw it. Camille discovered it before Ronan did. On her first visit to survey the building, she entered the main lobby and saw the name on a polished brass plaque: Marchetti Holdings. She stopped in her tracks. She had spent 6 years building a life completely separate from that name. Now it was right there in front of her, etched in bright, gleaming metal that was impossible to miss. Her first impulse was to void the contract, go back to Pilsen, and tell Benny Tran she was withdrawing to find any other job, anything that had no link to the Marchetti name. Then she remembered her 8 employees who were counting on her for work. This was her biggest contract ever. It was large enough to hire 5 more people and finally get health insurance for her entire staff. That was the one promise she had made from the start, but never had the funds to fulfill. She stood in the lobby looking at the name on the wall and took a deep breath. She was no longer the 22-year-old girl who trembled in yellow rubber gloves. She was an entrepreneur. She had a legitimate contract, and she would not let fear dictate her life anymore. She kept the job. For the first 2 weeks, things ran smoothly. Camille's team worked after hours, so the odds of seeing Ronan were almost zero. Camille visited once a week in the afternoon to check on things and sign papers with Benny Tran, leaving long before the top floor even knew she had been there. She thought she could maintain that distance. Then, on a Tuesday in the 3rd week, the fire sprinkler system on the 9th floor malfunctioned, triggering the alarm throughout the entire building. Red lights flashed while loudspeakers broadcast evacuation orders. More than 300 people poured into the stairwells as the elevators automatically locked down. Camille was on the 12th floor inspecting a recently cleaned area. Ronan was on the 15th floor in a meeting with Yolena. Both joined the flow of people in the emergency stairs. Between the 10th and 9th floors, the line stopped for a few seconds because of a jammed exit door. Camille turned and looked up, and Ronan was looking down. 6 years disappeared in a single moment. She recognized him right away. He was still tall, with those same cold gray eyes and wearing a black suit just like the last time. But now, faint lines were at the corners of his eyes, and a streak of silver was at his temple that wasn't there 6 years ago. He recognized her as well, but not as the girl he remembered. Camille stood before him in a white-collared blouse and slacks, her hair tied in a professional bun. An identification badge on her chest read Olympia Services, and under the company name was one word: owner. Her posture was perfect. Her eyes did not look away. She was not the housekeeper in a black uniform anymore, and they both understood that. "Camille," he said, his voice holding a tone she had never heard, not demanding or cold, but almost surprised. "Mr. Marchetti," she responded, her tone polite, steady, and appropriately formal. She then turned and continued down with the crowd. As everyone gathered in the lobby to wait for the all-clear, Ronan stood by the doors, looking toward the street. But he was not watching the street. His gaze was fixed on a corner of the lobby where a little girl with black hair sat on a bench next to one of Camille's workers. Her legs swung in the air as she drew in a small notebook. School was out for the day, so Amelia had tagged along with her mother. The child looked up, as if she sensed someone watching her, and those gray-green eyes met Ronan's gray eyes from across the crowded room. Amelia was not afraid, wasn't nervous. The little girl just glanced at him with the simple curiosity of a 5-year-old before looking down to continue her drawing. But Ronan couldn't just look away. He was frozen in the lobby of his own building, with hundreds of employees around him, yet he felt like he could not breathe. That little girl did not just have his eyes. She looked exactly like him, a miniature version. In that moment, he knew the online photo was real. The data had been correct. The piece of plastic in his desk was not a lie. The truth was just 10 steps away, drawing in a small notebook, completely unaware that the man staring at her was her father. 2 days after their encounter on the emergency stairs, Ronan's assistant called Camille. She was invited to a meeting to discuss the cleaning service contract, and it would be held in his private office on the top floor. It was a perfectly normal reason, but Camille knew it was not about the contract. She agreed to go because she was done running. That afternoon, she entered the building wearing a navy blazer with her hair in a low bun. She wore no jewelry, nothing extra. The elevator took her to the very top floor. When the doors slid open, she saw a long hallway with gray stone floors. Glass walls from floor to ceiling showed the entire Chicago skyline, with the river winding below like a silver ribbon. The assistant showed her into a private meeting room and then shut the door. Ronan was already inside. He was not wearing a suit today, just a black shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Camille noticed that small detail right away, because Ronan Marchetti always wore a suit like it was his armor. Taking it off meant he was trying to seem less intimidating. That simple intention told her this meeting was about more than just a cleaning contract. For the first 15 minutes, they only discussed business. Ronan asked her about service quality and how often she supervised. Camille answered every question perfectly. She was a total professional. She had run Olympia services for long enough to know how to face a powerful man without trembling. And Ronan could see she was not the same woman he once knew. He put his pen down on the table and was quiet for a moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely different. He no longer sounded like a chief executive officer reviewing a contract. 6 years ago, when you left my house, you were pregnant. It was not a question, it was a fact. Camille did not even blink. She did not get pale. She gave him none of the drama he might have been expecting. She met his eyes and was silent just long enough for him to know she was thinking carefully, not scrambling for a lie. The truth did not matter to you 6 years ago, Mr. Marchetti. Why should it matter now? His words felt like a punch Ronan could not block. It was not because she was wrong, but because she was so right. He had no defense. 6 years ago, he refused to listen. He did not want to hear it. He never gave her a single chance to explain. He took a deep breath and did something he had almost never done in his 37 years, not to anyone. I was wrong. Those 3 words were short, but they carried more weight than any order he had ever given. Camille's face did not change, but inside, something broke loose because it was the first time she had heard this man ever admit to a mistake. She knew, for a man like him, those 3 words were more difficult than a life-or-death deal. I know about Gianni, he continued. I know you did not take the money. I know everything, but I found out too late. Camille remained silent. She waited, knowing he had more to say. Ronan leaned in, and his voice got even quieter. But you need to understand something, Camille. If that little girl has Marchetti blood, it does not matter if you want it or not. She is in a kind of danger you cannot imagine. I have more enemies than you know, and they do not leave family alone. Camille felt her blood run cold. For 6 years, she had run from his name for that exact reason. She knew how dangerous his world was. She had cleaned blood from hallway floors and knew violence was not rare in his world. It was the standard. But she also knew that 6 years of hiding had not changed one thing. The blood connection did not just go away. Amelia's gray-green eyes would always be there, And if anyone looked closely enough, they would see the resemblance, whether the birth certificate named a father or not. Amelia is not a game piece, she said. Her voice was firm, but she squeezed her hands together under the table. She is not property. She is not a weakness or a target. She is my daughter. Is she my daughter too? The question filled the space between them, in that glass room high above Chicago, hanging over 6 years of silence. Camille looked at him for a long moment. She did not look hateful or weak, just tired of carrying a truth she had held by herself for 6 years. And it was now too much to carry on her own. Yes, she said. Amelia is yours. The room fell completely silent. The lights of the Chicago skyline twinkled behind the glass, as if the world outside had no clue that a single truth had just changed 3 lives forever. Ronan drove back to his Gold Coast mansion without a word. He did not turn on the radio or make any calls. For the first time in years, he drove himself, because he did not want a driver to see his face. He parked the car, walked through the dark house without flipping on a switch, and went right to his office and shut the door. He sat down in his chair and poured some whiskey from a bottle of Macallan. He put the glass on the desk but did not drink it. He opened a drawer and pulled out the old, yellowed piece of the pregnancy test. He laid it next to his phone, which showed the picture of Amelia that Yelena had sent him. The piece of plastic and the photograph sat side by side. One was the proof he had ignored 6 years ago, and the other was the result of that choice. A 5-year-old girl with his eyes and her mother's smile. He looked at the picture and started to add it all up. 5 birthdays he had missed. 5 Christmas mornings when he was not the one putting presents under her tree. He never saw her first step. He never heard her first word. He was not there for her first day of school. He never stayed up with her when she was sick. He never caught her when she fell. 5 years, day after day, moment after moment, had all passed without him even knowing. Now, all that lost time was a judgment that no lawyer could ever reduce. He looked at the plastic piece. He recalled the snapping sound it made in this very office 6 years ago. At the time he had asked, "What is that?" without even looking up. Then he went back to his laptop. If he had just gotten up, picked up the broken pieces, and asked one more question, just one, his entire life would be different. But he did not, because he was Ronan Marchetti, the man who had control over everything except his own ability to listen when it counted the most. He sat there in the dark. A sliver of light from the street cut across the untouched glass of whiskey. He felt something swelling up inside his chest, something hot and heavy that he did not recognize. He could not name the feeling at first, because he had buried it deep since he was a child, when his father taught him that tears were for the weak, and the weak had no place in the Marchetti family. But no one was here to see him tonight. No enemies, no friends, no bodyguards. It was just him and the photograph of a 5-year-old daughter who had no idea who her father was. A single tear fell down his right cheek. He wiped it away instantly with the back of his hand, a quick, practiced move from a man trained to hide all weakness. But that tear was real, and he knew it was. 15 miles from there, in an apartment in Pilsen, Camille sat on the edge of Amelia's bed and watched her daughter sleep. The little girl was on her side, hugging an old teddy bear. Her dark hair was spread out on the pillow, and her breathing was soft and steady. The small room was so quiet that Camille could hear the slow turn of the ceiling fan and the sounds of stray cats in the alley. She had built this peaceful life over 6 years, with hard work, with tears, and with long walks home in the snow. Amelia had friends, a good school, her Aunt Pola, and a stable life. She had everything a child could need except for a father. And now, that father knew she was alive. Camille was terrified. She was not scared that Ronan would hurt Amelia, but that his power would destroy the tiny, safe world she had built. His lawyers were much better than anyone she could ever hire. His money was more than she could make in her entire life. If he decided he wanted custody, she would have no chance at all in a courtroom. But then she looked at Amelia and thought about the question her daughter asked every single Father's Day, when her class made cards for their dads. "Mom, who do I give this to?" Every single time she heard it, model it. Her heart ached, and each time she'd say, "Make one for Aunt Pearl," then turn away before Amelia could see her eyes water. Amelia deserved to know her father. Camille understood that, even as it fought every protective instinct she had. She leaned down, kissed Amelia's forehead, and walked into the living room to sit alone in the darkness. On the other side of the city, Ronan was doing the exact same thing. Two souls caught between the past and the future, between fear and duty, and between their pride and a truth they both knew couldn't stay hidden. 3 days after that long night, Ronan called Camille. He was direct, no beating around the bush. He wanted a DNA test, not because he disbelieved her, but because he needed a legal basis before entering Amelia's life. "I don't want to show up with just words," he said. "I want to show up with responsibility, and responsibility requires paperwork." Camille was silent for a moment. She had nothing to fear from a test, and she knew that in the American legal system, it was the first step to establishing paternity, something she dreaded, but could not deny her child. "All right," she agreed, "but we do it my way. I pick the lab, not you." Ronan accepted instantly. The test took place at a private facility in Lakeview that Camille found online, a neutral ground with no ties to the Marchetti name. They collected cells from Amelia's cheek with a simple swab. She thought it was a routine health check and asked no questions. The results would take 2 weeks. For both of them, those 2 weeks were the longest of their lives. Camille tried to keep things normal. She took Amelia to school in the mornings, managed contracts in the afternoons, and cooked dinner and read bedtime stories at night. Everything seemed the same. But just beneath the surface was the constant knowledge that their world was about to shift in a way she could not control. Ronan spent those 2 weeks learning everything he could about Amelia. He was not invasive, but he looked for the public traces she had left in the world. The Erasco Academy website had pictures from school events. He found Amelia in a photo from a class math contest, standing in the front row with a paper medal pinned to her chest. In another picture, she was in the schoolyard next to a smaller boy, her hand on his shoulder protectively. The caption read, "Amelia Reyes was praised by her teacher for helping a new student feel welcome." Ronan looked at that photograph for a very long time. His daughter was protecting someone weaker, the exact opposite of what he had done 6 years earlier. But the detail that truly shook him came from a small article on the Pilsen Community Center's website about a career day for kids. Each child was asked what they wanted to be when they grew up. Next to the name Amelia Reyes, age 5, her answer was written out exactly as she said it. "I want to build a house nobody can break." Ronan read the line once, then read it again. Marchetti Holdings, the empire his grandfather had started, his father had grown, and he now commanded, was founded on construction, on real estate, on raising structures of concrete and steel. And a little girl, who had never known her father, who had never been inside a Marchetti building, wanted to build houses. Blood did not need a birth certificate to make itself known. It always found a way. The results came on a Thursday morning in a secure email to both of them. Ronan opened the file in his office. It was a single page of cold, scientific terms and statistics. And on the final line it read, "Probability of paternity, 99.9%. He already knew it was true. Her gray-green eyes had told him the first time he saw her in the lobby. But knowing something and seeing it in print are two different things. The black and white text turned his suspicion into his responsibility. The paper shook in his hand, not from shock, but from the immense weight of 6 lost years, now officially his to bear. Once the results were confirmed, Ronan called Camille to ask to see Amelia. Camille laid out her conditions immediately. They had to meet in a public place, with no bodyguards, and no one else could know. She would introduce him only as a friend of her mother's. Ronan agreed to every condition without argument. He knew this was not a negotiation where he held any power to make demands. They decided on Millennium Park for Saturday afternoon. Ronan showed up 30 minutes early. He parked his car 2 blocks away and walked, wearing a simple black Henley and dark jeans instead of a suit. He had even taken off his Patek Philippe watch and left it in the car. For the first time in many years, he was somewhere with no guards watching his back. He sat on a stone bench near the Cloud Gate sculpture, watching children run around the massive steel bean. Their laughter echoed against the Chicago sky. He realized he had not sat in a public space, alone among regular people, without scanning for threats or calculating risks in years. All he could think about was the 5-year-old girl who would be arriving soon, and he had no idea what to say to her. He had stood before a federal judge without trembling. He had faced down a rival mob boss without flinching. But the thought of talking to his own 5-year-old daughter was making his palms sweat. And then, he saw them. Camille was walking from Michigan Avenue, holding the hand of a little girl in a red coat, her black hair in a ponytail that bounced with each excited step. Amelia gazed at the park with wide gray-green eyes, taking in every sight with curiosity. As they approached, Ronan stood up, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his own ears. Camille stopped in front of him and said in a calm, even voice, "Amelia, this is Ronan. He's a friend of mine." Amelia looked up at him, tilting her head all the way back because he was so tall. Her gray-green eyes met his, and Ronan felt something deep inside him stir, a place he thought had been locked away for good. "Hello, sir," Amelia said, her voice clear and bright. She was not timid or shy, just polite, the way a well-raised child speaks to an adult. "Hi, Amelia," Ronan replied, forcing his voice to remain steady as his throat tightened. The three of them sat on the bench. Camille sat between them at first, but Amelia soon scooted over to sit next to Ronan, eager to ask him about the giant steel bean. Ronan explained that it was called Cloud Gate. She nodded, then started asking about his school, telling him about her best friend Lucia and about the painting she did in art class last week of a very tall building with many windows. Ronan just listened. He truly listened, not waiting for his turn to speak, but absorbing every single word from this child, as if it were the most important thing in the world. "What do you do?" Amelia asked him suddenly. "I build houses," Ronan said, boiling the entire Marchetti Holdings empire down to 3 simple words. "Big houses or small ones?" she asked. "Both." Amelia tilted her head, thinking. "I like the small houses more. They feel warmer." Camille had to look away so they wouldn't see the tears welling up in her eyes. Amelia's words were innocent, but they struck right at the heart of Ronan's life, because his Gold Coast mansion was enormous, and it had never once felt warm. Later, Camille bought Amelia an ice cream. The little girl picked chocolate, and after 2 licks, she had a brown smudge on the tip of her nose. Amelia tried to look at it by crossing her eyes, which made her burst into a bright, happy laugh. As Ronan watched her laugh, he started to laugh too. It was not the polite smile he used at parties or the cold smirk he used in business deals. It was a real smile that began in his eyes and spread to his mouth, the kind of smile he could not remember having for a very long time. When Camille saw it, something shifted inside her, like a locked door creaking open just a tiny bit, and she did not know if she wanted to push it open or slam it shut. Less than a week after their meeting in the park, a ghost from the past reappeared. Gianni Marchetti had not vanished as Ronan had hoped. After being exiled from the family and cut off from all his resources and protection, Gianni had drifted to the south side. His old debts remained, and his anger grew with each passing day. He finally contacted the Vulov Syndicate, the same Eastern European mob he owed money to, and made them a simple offer: inside information on the Marchetti family in exchange for protection and money. Gianni knew the security plans for the Gold Coast mansion, Ronan's daily schedule, the names of his guards, and the weak points in the family's finances system, and he was ready to sell every secret. But Gianni's most powerful leverage was not on paper. In the weeks following his exile, Before Ronan cut all ties, an old security contact still sent Gianni occasional texts. Through these fragmented messages, Gianni discovered that Ronan was visiting a location every Saturday without guards, which was unheard of. Driven by curiosity, Gianni tailed him and found Ronan in Millennium Park with a woman and a young girl. The child had the same gray-green eyes as Ronan. Gianni instantly knew the truth without needing any proof. At 11 o'clock on a weeknight, Ronan's phone rang, and he knew his brother's voice right away. "I thought you disowned me," Gianni sneered, a mix of bitterness and victory in his voice. "But it seems you have a secret nobody knows about. A daughter in Pilsen with your eyes. What a pity it would be if word got out, wouldn't it, brother?" For 3 seconds, Ronan was silent. Those 3 seconds felt like an eternity. In that short time, he understood that Amelia was no longer just his daughter. She was now a pawn in a dangerous game. This was precisely the outcome Camille had dreaded 6 years earlier, the very reason she kept their child a secret. Now, her worst fear was a reality. He hung up the phone. His first call was to security, where he assigned 2 men to watch the Pilsen apartment indefinitely. He then drove there himself, arriving near midnight. Parking before the red brick building Camille called home, he walked up the stairs to the 3rd floor for the very first time. The concrete was cracked, the iron railing felt loose, and a bare bulb flickered over peeling paint and exposed brick. A wave of shame hit Ronan as he took it all in. His daughter spent 5 years here while he lived in a mansion with shatterproof windows and warm floors. Camille answered after his 3rd knock, her eyes wary. She wore a simple nightgown, her hair down. The moment she saw Ronan, she knew there was trouble. He was not a man who made unannounced visits in the middle of the night. Ronan got straight to the point, telling her about the phone call from Gianni and the danger that now targeted Amelia. Camille did not react with fear, but with pure rage. 6 years of pent-up anger surfaced in her sharp, quiet words. "This is the exact reason I kept you away. This is the life I fought to protect my daughter from. And you have brought it right to my doorstep." Ronan remained silent and absorbed her words because he knew she was correct. He had no defense for his actions. "I know," he admitted, "but your anger does not change the fact that Amelia needs to be protected now. Let me handle it, not for my sake, but because she has a right to be safe." Camille studied him in the rundown hallway of a place he would never otherwise enter. She realized that slamming the door on him would not make the threat disappear. "Amelia must not find out," she declared, her tone shifting from fury to resolve. "Her daily life must remain the same. No guards at her school, no special cars, nothing to frighten her. If you are going to protect her, do it so she never even knows she is in danger." Ronan agreed with a nod before driving back to the Gold Coast, where he started to handle Gianni using the methods of his world. Yelena tracked the payments from the Volkov syndicate to Gianni. She then informed Vulov that Gianni had inflated the worth of his intelligence to get more money, instantly changing his status from a valuable source to a simple fraudster in their eyes. Simultaneously, Ronan delivered a firm message to the Vulov syndicate via a trusted go-between. Any action against the Marchetti family would be considered an act of war, a conflict no Chicago outfit could win. Vulov got the message. Gianni was suddenly without protection, money, or any remaining leverage. 2 weeks after that, he boarded a westbound bus in the middle of the night and vanished, just as Camille had vanished from the Gold Coast 6 years before. But Camille had departed with her head held high, while Gianni fled with nothing but a worthless name. With the threat resolved, the Saturday get-togethers in Millennium Park resumed. Ronan made sure to be there early each week. He wore no suit and had no visible security detail. Of course, 2 of his men were now always watching from afar, a detail Amelia would never notice. His visits became a regular feature of her weekends. She would proudly present her math grades, describe her latest school drawing, and ask him endless questions, from how skyscrapers stood up to why the sky in Chicago was usually gray. Ronan responded to each question with a calm patience that was new even to him. His life had never required such a quality. As the months went by, Camille observed from a distance, never getting in the way. She noticed Amelia seeking Ronan out more frequently. She saw how her daughter would sprint to their usual bench as soon as she saw him. She heard the stories that now started with, "Uncle Ronan said." Camille understood that the secret had an expiration date. Her daughter deserved the whole story, and each passing day was a lie. So, she picked a calm Sunday afternoon and asked Ronan to come to their Pilsen apartment. It was the second time he had climbed the red brick staircase, but this time it was not for a crisis, but for a resolution. When Ronan entered, Amelia was on the couch, sketching in a notebook. She glanced up and grinned. "Uncle Ronan," she said, before returning to her art. Camille sat next to her daughter, and Ronan sat in the chair facing them. The small living room made the space between them feel intimate. A fan spun lazily overhead as the late-day sun slanted across the worn wooden floor. Camille rested a hand on Amelia's leg, prompting the girl to pause her drawing. "Amelia, your mom has something very important to tell you." Amelia put her pencil aside. She looked from her mother to Ronan and back again, her gray-green eyes uncommonly serious for a child. "Ronan is not just my friend," Camille began, her voice steady even as her hand tightened slightly on Amelia's knee. "He is your father." A quiet settled over the room. It was not a tense, dramatic quiet, but the thoughtful silence of a 5-year-old trying to understand a very big idea. Her instincts, however, were sharper than most grown-ups would assume. Amelia did not weep or yell. She did not react wildly. Instead, she stared at Ronan for what felt like an eternity, her gaze a mirror of his own. Then, in a quiet but steady voice, she asked, "Why was Dad not here before?" Her question was straightforward, yet it held the weight of 5 Father's Days without a card, 5 years of hearing friends mention their dads, and 5 years of seeing an empty space on her birth certificate without questioning why. Ronan offered no excuses or complex stories about the situation. "Because I made a mistake," he answered quietly, his eyes fixed on his daughter's. "And I needed a long time to realize it." Amelia cocked her head, a familiar thinking pose, before asking a final question. "Do you realize it now?" "I do," Ronan replied. Just one word. That was all he needed. The 5-year-old before him was not looking for a complicated excuse. She just needed the certainty that her father was present now and that he finally understood. Amelia put down her notebook, got off the couch, walked the 2 short steps to Ronan, and put her arms around him. The hug was brief and light, 2 tiny arms wrapping around the man she had known as her uncle. But the embrace was strong enough to erase 6 years of separation in an instant. Ronan carefully hugged her back, treating her as if she were the most delicate thing in the world. And to him, she was. He was not a man who hugged. His life had no space for gentle affection. Yet, as his daughter's arms held him, an instinct more profound than any defense mechanism showed him how to rest a hand on her back and just be still. Camille watched them from the couch. As Amelia laid her head on Ronan's shoulder, Camille faced the window, and tears streamed down her cheeks. They were not tears of sorrow or anxiety, but of sheer relief. For 6 long years, she had borne this secret by herself. Now, the weight was finally shared. Her daughter at last had a father. And the little girl did not weep, she embraced him. Sometimes a 5-year-old's pardon is more direct and powerful than any legal judgment. In the weeks following that Sunday, the word Dad began to appear in Amelia's mouth like a small creature, learning to take his first steps. The first time she said it was at a park, so softly it was almost a whisper. "Dad, look at what I drew." Then she looked up at Ronan, as if checking if that word was okay to use. Ronan nodded, his eyes getting a little watery, but he turned away quickly. The next week, she said it a bit louder. "Dad, Lucia likes drawing houses too, like me. A week after that, the word came out as naturally as breathing. Dad, I am hungry. And Ronan knew it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard in his 37 years of life. Their relationship was built one brick at a time. Ronan slowly became a part of Amelia's daily life, not through his money or influence, but simply by being there. When Orozco Academy sent an invitation for the parent meeting at the start of the year, Camille asked Ronan if he wanted to come. He went, sitting on a tiny blue plastic chair in the kindergarten classroom. His knees were almost to his chest, surrounded by regular fathers in t-shirts and jeans. Ronan Marchetti looked so out of place it was almost comical. He was taller than almost everyone in the room, his back. He was used to sitting at the head of a boardroom, so even his casual Italian leather jacket cost more than what the other three fathers were wearing combined. But when the teacher asked who Amelia wanted to introduce, she stood up, pointed at Ronan and said, "This is my dad." Her voice was perfectly normal and full of pride. Suddenly, Ronan no longer felt out of place. He was just a dad on a tiny plastic chair, the only title that mattered there. Weeks later, Amelia came home with a drawing from art class. She set it on the kitchen table in their Pilsen apartment for Camille to see. It showed a house with big windows and a red roof, with three figures standing in a row in front. The tallest was on the left, one in the middle, and the smallest on the right. In a 5-year-old's unsteady hand, Amelia had written, "Mom, Dad, and me." Camille just stared at it. The tears were long gone, but a gentle warmth spread through her chest. It was a feeling that 6 years of fending for herself had made her forget. She put the drawing on the refrigerator with a flower magnet, and there it stayed. Then came Amelia's first weekend at the Gold Coast mansion. Camille only agreed after long talks with Ronan, making sure the rules about time and contact were clear. Ronan had a room waiting for Amelia, not a stuffy hotel suite, but a child's room. It had books on shelves, colored pencils on a desk, a soft blanket, and a window that looked out to the garden. Amelia entered the mansion, her eyes wide with wonder. She ran her hand along the wooden banister, gazed at the high ceilings, and raced through a living room bigger than their entire apartment. She stopped in a long hallway and said, "This house is very big, but it's a little sad, Dad." Ronan, right behind her, paused. "Why is it sad?" "Because there is no laughter here." The sentence was simple, as children's sentences are, yet it was more insightful than any report Yolena had ever written, because the mansion truly had no laughter. It never did. From his father's day to his, this house was filled only with orders, silence, and the sound of footsteps on wood floors. That night, the father and daughter watched a cartoon in the vast living room. Amelia snuggled on the sofa next to Ronan, her feet in cat-themed socks Camille had found at a thrift shop. Partway through the movie, Amelia looked up and asked Ronan with a sleepy but serious tone, "Dad, do you have regrets?" Ronan looked down at his daughter. "Yes." "About what?" "Not listening to your mom when I needed to listen." Amelia thought for a second, her gray-green eyes blinking slowly. Then she said, "That is okay, because you listen now." She turned back to the movie, as if she had just figured out a simple math problem. For Ronan, it was not simple. It was forgiveness. Not the complicated kind that adults give, but the pure forgiveness of a child who believes today is more important than yesterday. And he sat there in his own home and finally heard laughter in the mansion when Amelia giggled at a cartoon. He realized the 5-year-old beside him had given him what no one in his mafia world ever could. A true reason to want to change. Gossip spreads quickly in Chicago's upper crust, where the world is small and the mouths are big. Ronan Marchetti has a daughter out of wedlock with a former housekeeper. The story was passed around from one dinner party to another like a piece of entertainment. At a Friday night charity event at the Peninsula Hotel, where Chicago's elite mingled with wine and fake smiles, a business rival named Harrison Burke, who owned a competing real estate firm, leaned in. In a voice loud enough for Ronan to hear, he said to the men nearby. I heard Marchetti is playing house with the maid and her little bastard in Pilsen. Must be his new charity case. A few men chuckled nervously. Ronan placed his glass on the bar, turned, and in 2 steps was standing before Harrison Burke. His voice was quiet. He didn't have to shout because everyone there knew that when Ronan Marchetti spoke quietly, he was at his most dangerous. The woman you just mentioned built a company from scratch while you were busy counting your inheritance. She is the mother of my daughter. The next time you mention her, you had better earn that right first. Harrison Burke turned pale. For a few moments, the room was silent. Everyone understood Ronan's words were not a polite defense. They were a final warning, the Marchetti kind. That kind of warning never came twice. After the party, Ronan drove back to the mansion alone, thinking about his actions. He had openly claimed Amelia in front of Chicago's elite and had defended Camille's honor as his own, and he felt no regret. But back in the Pilsen apartment, Camille faced a different kind of fear. Amelia had just returned from her weekend at the Gold Coast mansion. Over dinner, she talked non-stop about her room at her dad's house, the big garden, and a bathtub as large as the bedroom she shared with her mother. Camille listened with a smile, but inside, a knot formed in her stomach. Ronan's world was so much bigger and brighter. Camille worried that their small 2-bedroom apartment, with its paper butterflies on the wall and a small bed, would start to feel tiny and plain to her daughter. But as Camille tucked Amelia into bed, the little girl snuggled into her familiar sheets, hugged her old bear, and said sleepily, Mom, our bed is warmer. Dad's is big, but our bed is warmer. Camille sat quietly on the bed for a moment before leaning down to kiss her daughter's forehead. She understood that love isn't measured by square footage or expensive sheets, and her daughter, at just 5, already knew the difference between big and warm, between having more and having enough. 15 minutes away, Ronan entered his office at the mansion, where his grandfather's portrait always hung. Grandfather Marchetti, the man who built his empire with blood and silence, stared down with painted eyes that never changed. Ronan looked at the portrait, then down at his phone, where the background was still a picture of Amelia's smile, a smudge of ice cream on her nose. That was the picture he chose after their day at Millennium Park. 2 photos represented 2 completely different lives. His grandfather had forged an empire with violence and fear. His daughter simply wanted to build a home that could never be broken. For the very first time, Ronan considered changing his ways, not for the FBI or for business, but because he couldn't bear the thought of Amelia one day learning the truth about her father's dark world. He could never leave the empire. The Mafia offers no retirement plan. But he could steer it toward legitimacy, dialing back the illegal operations and building stronger walls between his work and his family. That way, when Amelia was old enough to ask what he did for a living, his answer, I build houses, would be closer to the truth than a lie. The change between Ronan and Camille was not one big event. It was the result of 100 small moments that built upon each other over several weeks. He began calling her before making any choice concerning Amelia. Whether it was about buying new shoes for their daughter or deciding which weekends she would spend at his mansion, she eventually started taking his calls without that familiar tightening in her stomach. They slowly figured out how to talk to one another, not like a boss and his housekeeper, or a crime lord and the woman he had hurt, but like 2 parents sharing the duty of raising a child. Camille never forgot what happened, and Ronan never denied his part in it. But they both valued Amelia more than their own pride, and that became the only ground solid enough to build upon. One rainy evening, after a parent conference at Erasco Academy, Ronan offered to give Camille a ride back to Pilsen since she had taken the bus. After a moment of thought, Camille said yes. She did not accept because she needed the lift, but because she was growing tired of saying no just to prove her independence. They drove in silence for a while, exchanging only a few comments about Amelia, her grades in math, and the new drawing displayed in her classroom. When he pulled up to her red brick apartment building in Pilsen, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of wet pavement. Camille was opening her door when she paused, hearing Ronan speak. Thank you for not slamming the door in my face. She turned to look at him again. In the yellow streetlight coming through the windshield, Ronan's face did not seem like the cold mafia boss she recalled from 6 years ago. There was a new softness there. It was subtle, but she saw it. I did not do it for you, she said with honesty. I did it for Amelia. I know, he replied. Just 2 words, but his slow, quiet tone and the way he held her gaze said more than words ever could. And Camille looked back at him with an expression she could not quite hide. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but the wall between them was gone. It was something in the middle, in the space between the past and the future, between the hurt and the hope of healing. And in those few seconds, they both felt it. There was no move closer, no kiss, no touch, and no promises. It was just a single real moment between two people who had deeply wounded each other and were now standing on the fragile line between what was lost and what could be rebuilt. Camille got out of the car, said goodnight over her shoulder, and walked into her building without looking back. Ronan stayed in the car and watched the door close, not leaving right away. He knew this thing growing between them was not some dramatic movie romance. It was slower, more meaningful, and more real, built on a foundation of admitted mistakes and respect that was being earned day by day. And perhaps that was the only way for two people like them. One who grew up trusting no one, and one who had learned she did not need anyone, could find their way to each other without shattering the delicate thing they were both trying to protect. One spring afternoon, when Chicago finally shook off its gray winter coat, and the sky was so clear it stretched endlessly over Lake Michigan, the three of them went back to Millennium Park. It was the same stone bench, the same shiny cloud gate reflecting the clouds, and the same sound of children laughing on the grass. But everything felt different. 6 years before, Camille had left the Gold Coast mansion in the rain, with nothing but a life growing inside her. Now she walked beside the very man who had sent her away, not because she forgot, but because she chose to keep walking forward. Amelia ran on ahead, her black hair flying in the breeze as her sneakers tapped on the stone path. Her joyful laughter echoed in the open space between the city's tall buildings. Ronan and Camille followed behind her slowly. They were not holding hands or walking arm in arm, just close enough for their shoulders to nearly touch, but far enough apart to feel free. Camille watched her daughter play and spoke, her voice as steady as if she were commenting on the weather. Yet every word was filled with the weight of 6 long years. Do you ever think about it? That day in your office was the worst day of my entire life. But it was also the day that my new life, the one I have now, truly began. Ronan walked a few more steps in silence before he responded. And that was the day I lost the most valuable thing I ever had, and I was too blind to even see it. They did not say anything more. There was no need. The past was still with them, not forgotten or erased, but it was no longer a barrier between them. Instead, it was a foundation. It was ugly and flawed, but it was strong enough to support something new. Amelia paused by a reflecting pool, then turned to see them trailing behind her. She ran back, her hair wild and her gray-green eyes shining in the afternoon light. She took her mother's hand with her left and her father's with her right. "Come on," she urged, pulling them along. "Last one there has to buy ice cream." And so, the three of them moved forward together along the water. They were not a storybook family, and this was not a fairy tale ending in a grand castle. They were just 3 people who had been hurt, made mistakes, and lost important things. And they had made the choice to grow from it all instead of letting the past hold them back. We sometimes think that losing control is the worst thing that can happen to us. But the real danger is in not listening. Not listening when someone is trying to tell you their side. Not listening when the truth is right in front of your face. Not listening when your pride is yelling louder than your heart. Camille lost her job, but in doing so, she discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. Ronan lost 6 years, but he learned how to be a father, something that no amount of money or power could ever buy. And Amelia grew up knowing that love is not something you purchase with a big house or a fancy car. Love is proven by being present, by being patient, and by spending Saturday afternoons together on a park bench answering questions with honesty. Our mistakes do not have to define us, not if we find the courage to own them and to change. Responsibility is not a debt you pay with money. It is something you earn through your actions, day after day. And second chances do exist, not because we are entitled to them, but because someone else is kind enough to open a door they had every right to keep locked forever. For everyone listening to this story, please remember this. Never make a choice before you have listened completely. Do not let your ego make decisions for you. Do not judge a person by their situation, because you have no idea what they have endured just to be standing where they are today. Life will always give you back the seeds you plant, and love, no matter how deeply it has been buried, can always find a way to rise from the ashes if you just give it the opportunity. If this story resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Which character did you relate to the most? Have you ever had to make a choice when no one would listen? Or were you ever the one who refused to listen, only to regret it later? Please share in the comments section, because your story matters, and I truly want to hear from you with my whole heart. If you felt this story was meaningful, please click the like button and share this video with the people you care about. Someone you know might need to hear this exact message at this very moment. And if you are new here, please subscribe and turn on your notifications so you do not miss the new stories we share every day. Because on this channel, every story holds a lesson that could change how you look at the world. I wish every single one of you watching this video good health, a life filled with joy, and peace in your hearts every single day. Thank you for being with me all the way to the end. Goodbye, and I look forward to seeing you in our next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.